"Please, don't leave me here alone," she whispered, clutching the file like it was her last shield. In the cold silence of the subway, when no one else stepped forward, a single father, with nothing but a toolbox in his hand, chose to stand beside her. If you believe one quiet act of courage can change everything, stay with this story till the end. I should have known better. That thought circled in my head as the echo of my heels followed me down the deserted Brooklyn subway stairs. Midnight was no place for someone like me. Not anymore. Not after the rumors. Not after the whispers that my company was collapsing under fraud allegations. But when the message came, urgent, promising answers, promising a way out, I convinced myself I had no choice. I told myself I was still in control, still the CEO, still someone whose name meant something. Yet with every step deeper into the tiled tunnel, I felt that image cracking. 2 men waited on the platform. They weren't strangers to this kind of work. You could tell by the way they stood, heavy jackets, hands never too far from their pockets. My pulse quickened, but I forced my voice steady. "You asked me to come," I said. "Where's the proof?" The taller one grinned, showing the kind of teeth that had never seen a boardroom. "Proof comes after you sign." He pulled a folder from inside his coat, flipping it open so the papers inside flashed under the buzzing fluorescent lights. I didn't reach for it. My instinct told me the moment I touched those documents, I'd be finished. They didn't want my name. They wanted my silence. They wanted me complicit. My voice faltered. Just once. "You don't scare me." But they did. And they knew it. The shorter one stepped closer, the smell of cigarettes clinging to him. "Everyone's talking, Miss Blake. They say you're guilty already. One signature, and we can all make this easier." I backed away until the wall pressed against my shoulder blades. The chill of the tiles cut through my coat. I hated how weak my voice sounded when I whispered, "Please, don't leave me here alone." That was the moment he appeared. A man in worn work boots, carrying a toolbox. His presence didn't belong to this world of shadows. He looked like someone caught between shifts, someone ordinary. But when his eyes took in the scene, something shifted. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was calm, not loud, but it carried in the tunnel. The 2 men turned, annoyed at first. But then they hesitated. Maybe it was the way he stood, solid, like he'd planted himself into the ground. Maybe it was his eyes, steady, unflinching. "This doesn't concern you," the tall one muttered. The man with the toolbox set it down gently, the sound echoing like punctuation. "It does if she's in trouble." I wanted to tell him to leave, to walk away before these men dragged him into my mess. But the words never left my mouth. The shorter thug sneered. "Who are you supposed to be? Her bodyguard?" He didn't answer. He just took a step forward, shoulders square, and in that silence I felt the balance shift. For the first time that night, I wasn't the weakest person in the room. The taller man closed the folder with a snap. "Not worth it," he muttered, though I could hear the frustration in his voice. They backed away slowly, their bravado thinning. "This isn't over, Miss Blake." And then they were gone, swallowed by the stairwell shadows. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. My hands shook as I pressed them against the wall, trying to steady myself. He turned to me, picking up his toolbox again like this was nothing unusual. His eyes softened, though his expression stayed guarded. "You all right?" I wanted to laugh, or cry, or both. "Do I look all right?" My voice cracked more than I wanted it to. He didn't smile. He just nodded, like he respected the honesty. "Come on," he said quietly. "It's not safe down here." I hesitated. "Why did you stop?" His answer was simple. "Because you asked." Something in those words stayed with me. Not because they were grand, but because they weren't. He hadn't stepped in for reward, or recognition. He had just seen someone in danger and refused to look away. We walked together toward the exit. I noticed the rough edges on his hands, the calluses, the small scars of a life lived far from corporate offices. Everything about him felt steady, rooted in a world I barely understood. At the top of the stairs, under the sickly glow of the streetlight, I finally found the courage to ask, "What's your name?" He shifted his toolbox from one hand to the other. "Caleb." I nodded, holding the name in my mind like a lifeline. "Thank you, Caleb." He gave the smallest shrug, as if it wasn't worth mentioning. And then he started to turn away, disappearing into the night. I wanted to call after him, to tell him how much that moment had meant, how much it had saved me. But the words never came. I just stood there, watching the stranger who had stepped forward when no one else did. For the first time in months, I felt the faintest flicker of something I thought I'd lost forever. Not safety, not certainty, but the hope that maybe I wasn't as alone as I believed. I didn't know then how much that single night would change everything, how Caleb's presence would unravel the lies I had built my life upon, or how his quiet strength would become the mirror I couldn't escape. All I knew, as I watched him disappear into the dark, was that my life no longer belonged to boardrooms and headlines. It now carried the weight of a stranger's choice. And deep inside, I feared that whoever had sent me down into that subway would not forgive the fact that I had walked back up alive. I kept walking long after Caleb disappeared, my heels clicking against wet sidewalks until the city swallowed the sound. I told myself it was over, that the subway was just another mistake in a long list of missteps. But his face wouldn't leave my mind, the calm, unshaken way he had stood between me and the men who wanted me ruined. He hadn't asked who I was, or why I was there. He had just stayed. It struck me because no one else ever did. Not in the boardroom, not in my own home, not even in the company I built with my name on every door. When things went wrong, people scattered. But he, this stranger with a toolbox, stood firm. The next morning, my life resumed its ugly rhythm. Lawyers called, reporters hovered outside the lobby, investors demanded explanations. My assistant whispered that the stock was dropping, and every whisper in the elevator was about me. But in every meeting, every half-truth I was forced to tell, I kept hearing his answer, "Because you asked." By evening, the exhaustion hollowed me out. I didn't go back to my penthouse. Instead, I wandered without purpose, and somehow ended up near Queens. I don't remember why I stopped, only that a small hardware store was closing for the night, and there he was, locking the door. I froze. He looked up and noticed me instantly. His face didn't show surprise, but recognition. "You followed me." His tone wasn't accusing, just curious. I shook my head. "No. I just didn't want to go home." The words slipped out before I could shape them into something more dignified. He studied me quietly. Then he unlocked the door again. "Come inside." The store smelled of sawdust and oil, shelves lined with tools and supplies I didn't understand. He moved with ease, placing items back, wiping counters, counting receipts. I stood there useless, the hum of a fluorescent light filling the silence between us. Finally, I asked, "Why didn't you walk away last night?" Most people would have. He didn't look at me when he answered. "Because walking away is easier. But easier doesn't make it right." I almost laughed at the simplicity of it. In my world, every decision came wrapped in contracts and consequences. Nothing was ever that clear. I tried again. "You could have been hurt." He glanced at me then, steady as before. "So could you." There was no bravado in his tone. Just a fact, spoken by someone who knew life didn't bend for comfort. The silence stretched again, but this time it didn't feel unbearable. I watched him lock up a second time, and when we stepped out into the cool air, I found myself asking the question I never asked anyone. "Do you live far?" He hesitated, as if weighing whether to tell me. Then he nodded down the block. "Not far." I don't know why I followed him. Maybe because I was tired of being surrounded by people paid to stay close to me. Maybe because the thought of returning to an empty apartment felt heavier than I could carry. His building was modest, paint peeling from the stairwell. The kind of place I hadn't stepped into since before I made my first million. Yet when the door opened, warmth spilled out. "Hi, Daddy." A small voice rang from the living room. A girl ran forward, no older than 6, curls bouncing, eyes bright. She stopped when she saw me, tilting her head in quiet curiosity. "This is Lena," he said. His voice softened in a way I hadn't heard before. Lena, this is a friend. Friend. The word felt foreign, but he said it like it wasn't temporary. Lena grinned, holding up a small robot made of wires and tin. I built this today. Do you want to see? I crouched down, surprised by her eagerness. You built that yourself? She nodded proudly. Daddy says fixing things makes them stronger. Even people. The words hit me harder than I expected. Stronger. Even people. I spent the evening there, on a couch that sagged slightly, in a home that smelled faintly of lavender and bread. I listened to Lena chatter about her inventions, watched Caleb move around the kitchen with ease, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. Before I left, I said the thing that had been sitting on my chest since the subway. Thank you, Caleb, for not leaving. He looked at me, then at his daughter curled against him. Sometimes staying is the only thing that matters. I carried those words with me into the night, knowing that in a world built on leaving, I had met the man who stayed. And I didn't yet realize that staying would cost both of us more than we could imagine. I didn't mean to return so soon. But 2 nights later, when the walls of my penthouse pressed in with their silence and the phones wouldn't stop ringing with calls I didn't want to answer, I found myself back in Queens. Back at his door. Caleb opened it like he already knew I'd be there. He didn't ask questions, just stepped aside to let me in. Lena was asleep this time, her small form curled beneath a blanket on the couch. A half-finished robot rested on the coffee table beside her. I lowered my voice. Does she always sleep out here? He nodded. She says she dreams better near the machines she makes. There was a faint pride in his voice, but also something deeper, something guarded. We sat at his small kitchen table, the hum of the fridge filling the silence. For a while, neither of us spoke. I thought of the board meetings waiting for me, the documents piling up on my desk, the rumors turning sharper each day. And then I thought of him, this man who lived outside all of it, yet had stepped into my chaos without hesitation. You're not curious about who I am? I asked finally. He shrugged. I know enough. Enough. You're someone who needed help. That's enough for me. It was disarming, the way he stripped everything down to its core. In my world, every introduction began with titles, degrees, reputation. Here, none of that mattered. I studied his face, lined in places I hadn't noticed before. He was younger than the weight he carried. What about you? I asked softly. What's your story? For the first time, I saw hesitation in his eyes. He looked toward the couch where Lena slept, then back at me. My wife's name was Julia, he began. His voice was steady, but the way he gripped his mug told me he was holding more than words. She died in a fire. 3 years ago. The words settled between us like ash. I wanted to offer comfort, but his tone left no space for pity. He continued, almost mechanically. It was an apartment fire. Faulty wiring. I filed a report weeks before, told them something was wrong. They ignored it. Said it wasn't urgent. A chill ran down my spine. Who ignored it? His gaze sharpened, and I felt the ground shift beneath me before he even spoke. Your company. Blake Properties. The name hit me like a blow. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I thought of all the reports that crossed my desk, all the warnings filtered through layers of middlemen and lawyers. Had his been one of them? Had I signed it away with a careless stroke of my pen? He didn't accuse me directly. That was almost worse. Julia was trapped inside, he said quietly. By the time the fire department came, it was too late. Lena was 4. She asked me for months why her mom didn't wake up. His voice didn't break. Mine did. Caleb. I didn't know. He studied me for a long moment. I believe you. But not knowing doesn't change what happened. The shame burned through me, deeper than anything I had faced in boardrooms or headlines. Fraud rumors, collapsing stock, those were numbers. This was flesh and bone. This was a woman's life, a child's loss, a man's grief. I whispered, I'm sorry. He nodded, but it wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. It doesn't bring her back. We sat in silence again, but this time it was heavier, filled with ghosts neither of us could banish. At last, he said, I don't blame you alone. It's the system. People at the top sign papers. People at the bottom suffer. That's how it's always been. His words cut deeper than anger ever could. He wasn't shouting, wasn't accusing. He was simply telling the truth. And for the first time in years, I didn't have a defense. I looked at Lena's small form on the couch. She shifted in her sleep, clutching a piece of wire in her hand like it was treasure. She's strong, I said quietly. He followed my gaze. She had no choice. Something inside me cracked then, the realization that while I fought for image and survival in glossy towers, this man fought every day just to keep his daughter whole. Before I left that night, I stood by the door, my hand on the knob, and forced myself to ask the question I feared most. If you could, would you want my company destroyed? He met my eyes with a calm so steady it unsettled me. I want accountability. That's not the same thing as destruction. But if destruction is the only way accountability comes. He let the sentence fade, unfinished but sharp. I carried those words back into the city, into my penthouse where the lights reflected off glass and steel but never warmed a single corner. For the first time, I saw my empire not as a monument, but as a machine, one that had crushed people like Caleb and Julia without even pausing. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to save it anymore. I never liked that boardroom. The glass walls were meant to show transparency, but in reality, they made every meeting feel like being observed in a tank. By the time I walked in that morning, I already knew whispers had grown into storms. The seats were filled with faces I had once trusted, some of them avoiding my eyes, some studying me with a kind of silence that feels colder than words. I sat down at the head of the table, but I could feel how fragile the chair had become beneath me. Not in wood or leather, but in authority. My own creation, the company I had built from the ground up, was no longer safe in my hands. And yet, I forced myself to steady my breathing. Weakness here would be blood in the water. The CFO was the first to speak. His voice was calm, too calm. Savannah, there are concerns about the missing transfers. Legal exposure, you understand. The investors are restless. He didn't accuse me outright. They rarely did at first. They circled, waiting for someone else to draw first blood. I answered quietly, because volume has never won battles. Every transfer was approved. Every report filed. If there are questions, bring them here. I'll answer each one. But I could see it. My answers weren't what they wanted. The truth rarely is when ambition clouds the room. The chairman leaned forward. It's not just paperwork. It's trust, Savannah. Clients are reconsidering contracts. Rumors are out of control. You've become a liability. That word stayed with me. Liability. As if all the nights I had given up sleep, all the years I'd sacrificed family, love, and health, had now reduced me to a number on their risk chart. I felt something crack deep inside me, not loud, just quiet enough to hear in my own chest. One of the younger directors, one I had mentored personally, spoke next. His eyes avoided mine. Perhaps it's time for new leadership. To protect what you built, of course. The irony nearly made me laugh. Protect what I built, by removing me from it. I wanted to fight back. To remind them how I had carried this company when it was just an idea written on napkins. To remind them that they were sitting in their expensive suits because I had given them a seat at this table. But I didn't. Words would mean nothing now. Instead, I remembered Caleb. Just 2 nights before, in the subway, I had begged a stranger not to leave me. And he hadn't. That quiet strength had stayed with me. Sitting in the boardroom, I realized, if I begged here, no one would step forward. Not for me. The chairman pushed a folder across the table. Sign this. Transition of power. The sooner this is official, the smoother it will be for everyone. I looked at the papers. The lines were ready for my name, like a grave waiting for the stone. I remembered the pen I had refused to touch in the subway. Now another pen waited for me, this one gilded, heavier, meant to feel like an honor. My voice was steadier than I expected. You want me to sign away the company? The CFO replied without emotion. For the company's survival, yes. I leaned back, closing the folder without touching it. No. The words seemed to slice the air. A few faces stiffened, a few eyes darted away. They weren't expecting refusal. They expected surrender. Savannah, the chairman warned, you're cornered. The evidence is against you. Finally, I allowed myself a bitter smile. Evidence you planted. I know how this game is played. But understand this, if I built something once, I can build again. And I don't sign my own execution. There was silence then. Heavy. It told me everything. They had already decided I was out. Whether I signed or not, they would drag me through courts, through the press, through the mud. But at least I would not help them do it. I stood, gathering my bag. One of the directors whispered, almost with regret, Savannah, don't make this harder than it has to be. I turned to him, my voice low but certain. Harder than stealing from me in daylight. Harder than betraying every promise we made in this room. He said nothing. None of them did. Their silence was their confession. I walked out without looking back. The glass doors reflected my face, tired, but not broken. For the first time, I saw myself not as a CEO, not as a leader surrounded by shadows, but simply as a woman standing alone. And maybe that was enough. In the hallway, my phone buzzed. A message from Caleb. Just 5 words. Did you make it out? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the question sit with me. I had left the boardroom, yes, but making it out? That was something else entirely. As I stepped into the elevator, I whispered to myself, not yet. But I will. The doors closed, and with them, the chapter of who I had been. What came next, I wasn't sure. But I knew one thing, I would not let them define the end of my story. The headlines came faster than I expected. By evening, my name was no longer spoken with respect. It was dragged across television screens, printed in bold on business columns, and whispered in every office lobby that had once displayed my portrait with pride. CEO under fire for financial misconduct. Blake Corporation faces leadership crisis. Savannah Blake, from visionary to suspect. I read them once, then stopped. You can't keep reading the same funeral notice. At some point, you have to accept that the world has already buried you. The hardest part wasn't the headlines, though. It was the silence that followed. People I thought would call didn't. Friends I'd supported vanished. Even family kept their distance, afraid that my scandal would rub off on them. Betrayal cuts deepest when it comes dressed as absence. I tried to busy myself at home, but a quiet apartment has a way of amplifying doubts. Every room felt too large, too empty. I had built my life around a schedule of meetings, negotiations, and constant movement. Now there was only stillness, and in that stillness, shame grew louder. It was late one night, sitting by the window with the city lights bleeding into the glass, when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me swipe. Savannah. The voice was steady, grounded. Caleb. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Hearing his voice reminded me of that night in the subway, how close I had come to being broken. I heard about the boardroom, he said quietly. You don't have to explain. I just wanted to know if you're okay. I laughed bitterly. Okay. I've been erased, Caleb. I spent 20 years building something, and they took it from me in a single meeting. Now the world thinks I'm a thief. There was silence on the line, the kind that isn't uncomfortable but patient. Finally, he said, you're not what they say you are. Don't let them decide who you are. I closed my eyes. That's easy to say when your life isn't burning. My life's burned before, he answered. Different fire, same pain. When my wife died, people looked at me like I was broken, like I couldn't raise my daughter. They judged without knowing. You learn to breathe through it. You learn not to live for their approval. His words settled over me like a weight, not crushing, but grounding. He wasn't offering pity. He was offering perspective. "Why are you calling me, Caleb?" I asked softly. "Because you didn't deserve what happened in that subway. And you don't deserve this either. Sometimes people just need someone to remind them they're not alone." I didn't reply right away. For the first time in days, I felt something other than humiliation. I felt seen. Over the next week, he kept checking in. Short messages. Occasional calls. Never intrusive, always simple. "Did you eat today? You'll get through this. Keep walking." It was strange. A man I barely knew was showing me more loyalty than people I had known for years. And yet, I found myself waiting for his voice, those small reminders that I was still more than my downfall. But outside that fragile connection, the world was merciless. Reporters followed me. Strangers recognized me in coffee shops, whispering as though I couldn't hear. Online, my name was torn apart by people who had never met me. Some said I deserved prison. Some said I was finished. All of them spoke like they owned the right to my story. One afternoon, I walked past the building where my office used to be. Through the glass lobby, I saw them, my former board, gathered in suits, laughing, moving on as if I had never existed. My chest tightened. I pressed my hand against the cold glass, but I didn't go in. That world was gone. That night, I told Caleb about it. They looked happy without me, like I was never needed at all. He paused before answering. "That's what betrayal does. It pretends you were disposable. But you weren't. The company wasn't built on their backs. It was built on yours. Don't confuse their greed with your worth." His voice was calm, but I could hear something beneath it, his own history with loss, with being underestimated. I realized then that we were both people who had been forced to start over, unwillingly, unfairly. Maybe that was why his words mattered more than anyone else's. Still, every morning I woke up to the same question. Who am I without the title? Without the office? Without the name they just erased? For years, being CEO wasn't just my job, it was my identity. And now that identity was gone, leaving a silence I didn't know how to fill. But silence, I was beginning to understand, was also space. And space could be rebuilt. The first step wasn't grand. It wasn't a public defense or a legal battle. It was smaller than that. One morning, instead of hiding behind curtains, I walked outside and bought my own coffee. No driver. No assistant. Just me standing in line like everyone else. It felt ridiculous, but it also felt real. A man in line looked at me, recognition flickering in his eyes. For a moment, I braced for the whisper, the judgment. But he only nodded politely, as if I were no one special. And strangely, that was a relief. Later that day, Caleb called again. I told him about it. "It's funny," I admitted. For the first time, being invisible didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like freedom. "That's the thing," he said. "Once they strip everything away, you start to see what's left. And what's left, that's the real you." I held on to that. Because maybe, just maybe, the fall wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning of something I hadn't yet imagined. I had always thought revenge meant striking fast, making them feel what I felt. But the longer I sat with the ruins of my name, the more I realized, that kind of fire burns too quickly. What I needed wasn't an explosion. It was something quieter, something that lasted. The world still believed I was guilty. Every article, every headline painted me as the woman who had betrayed her own company. The board had moved on, already installing a new face in my chair, smiling for cameras as if history had been rewritten. But the truth still lived inside me, and I wasn't ready to let it die there. The first step wasn't legal. It wasn't public. It was private, almost invisible. I started collecting emails, contracts, paper trails the board thought I'd forgotten. Late-night searches through old hard drives, careful phone calls to people who still owed me quiet favors. Piece by piece, I rebuilt the map of their betrayal. Each document I found was like oxygen to the fire inside me. Proof of what they had done. Proof that I wasn't the villain they wanted me to be. But I didn't rush. Timing mattered. If I showed my cards too early, they would bury me deeper. Meanwhile, life outside the plan was simple. Days spent in my apartment. Nights spent on the phone with Caleb. He never asked what I was doing, but I think he knew. His voice had a way of reminding me that I wasn't just chasing justice. I was trying to reclaim myself. One night, I told him, I can't just sit in this silence forever. If I don't do something, they win. He answered softly, then don't let them win. But don't lose yourself in the fight either. I thought about that long after the call ended. He was right. The fight couldn't just be about them. It had to be about me too, about dignity. So, I started small. I reached out to an old journalist I trusted, someone who had once written about me not as a CEO but as a person. I didn't give her everything. Just a glimpse. Enough to plant seeds of doubt in the narrative the board had created. When the article came out, it wasn't explosive. It was quiet. Careful. A few questions raised, a few inconsistencies highlighted. But it was enough. For the first time, the headlines weren't one-sided. Some voices asked, what if Savannah Blake isn't the villain? What if she's the scapegoat? The board ignored it publicly, but I knew them well. Behind those glass walls, they were restless. They had built their power on certainty, and I had just cracked it. Still, the war was far from over, and I couldn't fight it alone. One evening, I found myself standing in front of Caleb's workshop. He opened the door, wiping sawdust from his hands. For a moment, I just watched him, this single father who carried his world with quiet strength, no spotlight, no boardroom. He wasn't powerful in the way I used to measure power, but he was steady. And I needed that steadiness. I shouldn't drag you into this, I said, stepping inside. He looked at me, calm as always. You didn't drag me. I chose to step in that night. And I'm still here. I exhaled, finally letting the truth slip out. They set me up, Caleb. I have proof. Enough to ruin them. But if I release it, they'll come after me harder. Legally. Publicly. They'll destroy whatever's left of me. He studied me quietly, then said, the question is, what do you want more? Revenge, or freedom? I froze. No one had asked me that. Everyone assumed the answer was obvious. But his question forced me to look deeper. What did I want more? To see them fall, or to see myself rise again? That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk, staring at the files I had collected. Revenge was tempting. But Caleb's words kept circling back. Freedom. Could I have both? The answer, I realized, was yes, but only if I did it on my terms. Not by becoming like them, but by standing in the light they had tried to strip from me. So I began crafting something different. Not a scandal. Not a spectacle. A story. My story. I started writing every detail of the fraud, every manipulation, every moment they had tried to erase. Not in corporate language, but in human language. The nights I had worked until dawn. The sacrifices I had made. The betrayal I had endured. It wasn't just evidence. It was testimony. By the time I finished, dawn was breaking outside my window. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from clarity. For the first time since the fall, I didn't feel erased. I felt alive. The story wasn't ready to share yet, but it would be. When the moment was right, I would release it, not as an attack, but as truth. Quiet, steady, undeniable. And when that day came, I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't be standing alone. Some battles are fought in silence, but their echoes never fade. If this story touched you, subscribe and stay with us, because more stories of quiet strength and human dignity are waiting for you here.